The scariest lies are mostly the ones that look most perfect. Natalie McNally crime story is a real example. On the night Natalie McNally was killed, there was something that should have protected the truth. Something solid. Something that anyone would believe at first, because it is almost impossible to fake. A 6-hour live stream. A man sitting in his home, playing a video game online on a live stream with thousands of people watching. An alibi so perfect it made suspicion feel unreasonable. But what if we told you that the most important piece of evidence in this case was never real? December 18th, 2022. It was the kind of evening people gather for. Warm lights, quiet conversations, the world slowing down just enough to enjoy something simple. The FIFA World Cup final was on, and like millions of others, Natalie McNally spent part of her day watching it with her family. There was nothing unusual about her, nothing that suggested she was in danger. Natalie was 32 years old. She lived in Lurgan, County Armagh, a place where people knew each other, where routines felt safe, where doors weren't always locked with fear in mind. And that matters, because when something breaks that sense of safety, it doesn't just affect one person, it ripples outward. Before we talk about what happened to her, we need to understand who she was. Not just a name in a headline, not just a victim in a case file. Natalie was a daughter, a sister, a woman building a future. She had recently shared something deeply personal with her family, something that should have been joyful. She was pregnant, 15 weeks along, a new life growing quietly, full of possibility. Plans were forming, conversations were happening. There was something to look forward to, and at the center of that future was someone she trusted. Natalie met Stephen McCullagh just a few months earlier, in August 2022, through a dating app. Like many modern relationships, it started simply. Messages, conversations, shared moments, and then something more serious. By November, Natalie had told her family she was carrying his child. From the outside, it looked like things were moving forward. Quickly, yes, but not unusually, not dangerously. But this is where we need to slow down, because in many cases like this, the warning signs don't come as loud alarms. They come as small inconsistencies, things that feel slightly off but not enough to act on. And sometimes we ignore them. We want to pause here for a moment. If you're drawn to true crime stories that don't just shock, but help you understand people, behavior, and the warning signs we often miss, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support truly matters. It allows us to continue telling these stories carefully, responsibly, and in a way that can actually help us all become more aware of danger when it doesn't look like danger. Now, let's continue. After spending time with her parents that day, Natalie returned to her home in Lurgan sometime after 5 p.m. Nothing about that moment felt significant. It never does. We don't recognize the last normal moment while we're in it. She walked into her home likely expecting a quiet night, maybe rest, maybe a message from someone she cared about, maybe just time to herself. What she didn't know was that someone would come to that door later that evening, and she would let them in. When police were called to Natalie's home the following night, what they found raised immediate questions. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken locks, no shattered windows, no evidence of someone breaking in. That detail changes everything, because it tells us something simple but deeply unsettling. Natalie knew her killer, or at the very least, she didn't feel threatened by them. She opened the door willingly, and in cases like this, that moment, the moment of trust, is often the most tragic. As investigators began reconstructing the timeline, something started to take shape. CCTV footage captured a figure entering the area around Natalie's home at approximately 8:52 p.m. A man, carrying a rucksack, moving with purpose. Then later, around 9:30 p.m., the same figure leaving. Between those two moments, less than an hour, something devastating had happened inside that house. And yet, at that point, there was still no clear suspect, no obvious explanation, only fragments. Here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Because while investigators were trying to piece together what happened, there was already someone who appeared to be beyond suspicion. Stephen McCullagh, Natalie's boyfriend. When police first looked at him, there was something that seemed to eliminate him almost immediately. He had an alibi, a strong one. On the night Natalie was killed, Stephen McCullagh was supposedly at home, live streaming for hours on his YouTube channel, not just offline, not unreachable, visible, documented, watched in real time. To anyone looking at that surface-level evidence, it created a powerful assumption. He couldn't have been there. And this is where human psychology comes into play. We want to believe in clear answers. We trust evidence that feels concrete, videos, timestamps, public records. When something looks solid, we stop questioning it. The live stream did exactly that. It gave people something to hold on to, something that made the story feel less complicated, less disturbing. Because if he was there on camera for hours, then the danger had to be somewhere else, someone else. But sometimes, the most dangerous lies are built with just enough truth to feel real. There's a moment in every case like this, a moment we wish we could go back to, not to change everything, just to change one decision, one step, one answer at the door. Because on the night of December 18th, 2022, everything came down to a single, quiet moment. A knock. After leaving her parents' house, Natalie returned home sometime in the early evening. We can imagine what that looked like. Not perfectly, but closely enough to feel it. The house was quiet. Maybe the television was still on from earlier. Maybe she scrolled through her phone. Maybe she thought about the future, the one that was already beginning to take shape inside her. 15 weeks pregnant. That changes how you think, how you plan, how you trust. Because you're not just thinking for yourself anymore. And that's what makes what happened next so much harder to process. At 8:52 p.m., CCTV cameras captured a figure moving toward Natalie's home. A man, dressed in dark clothing, his face partially concealed. A rucksack slung over his shoulder. Nothing about his movement looked random. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't hesitating. He knew where he was going, and more importantly, he knew who was inside. When we think about danger, we often imagine something obvious. A stranger, a threat we can see coming. Something that triggers fear immediately. But that's not what happened here, because Natalie opened the door. There was no forced entry, no struggle outside, no sign that she tried to keep someone out, which means, in that moment, she didn't feel afraid. And that tells us something deeply uncomfortable. The person standing at that door was someone she trusted. What happened next didn't last long. Investigators would later determine that the attack took place within a relatively short window, between 8:52 p.m. and 9:30 p.m., less than an hour. That's all it took. We won't focus on graphic detail. That's not where the truth of this story lives. What matters is this. The attack was sudden, it was violent, and it was personal. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't random. This was intent. When Natalie was found the following night, the scene inside her home spoke volumes, not through words, but through what was left behind. There were signs of a struggle, signs that she tried to defend herself, signs that she didn't understand what was happening until it was already too late. And yet, there was also something missing. There was no theft, nothing taken, nothing disturbed beyond the violence itself, which removes one possibility entirely. This wasn't about robbery. This wasn't about opportunity. This was targeted. At approximately 9:30 p.m., CCTV captured the same figure leaving the area. Same clothing, same rucksack. But something had changed. The pace, the posture, the purpose had shifted from approaching to escaping. And then, just like that, he was gone. No noise, no witnesses, no immediate alarm raised. Inside that house, silence returned. But it wasn't the same silence Natalie had walked into earlier that evening. This one carried something else. What makes this part of the story even more haunting is what didn't happen next. No one knew. No one called for help. No neighbor reported anything unusual. No immediate response followed. Natalie lay there through the night, hours passing. The world outside continuing as normal, and that's one of the hardest truths in cases like this. Life doesn't stop when something terrible happens. It keeps moving, unaware. It wasn't until the next day, December 19th, that Natalie was found. Her family had become concerned. Something wasn't right. She wasn't responding. And that instinct, the one we sometimes ignore, led them to her home. And when they entered, everything changed. There are moments in life that divide everything into before and after. This was one of them. News began to spread. A young woman, pregnant, killed in her own home. In a place like Lurgan, that kind of event doesn't stay contained. It moves through people, quietly at first, then all at once. Questions started forming immediately. Who would do this? Why her? How did this happen without anyone knowing? And beneath all of that, a deeper fear. If this could happen to her, could it happen to anyone? At first glance, the case seemed like it had clear starting points. CCTV footage, a defined time window, a known victim with a relatively small circle. And statistically, in cases like this, investigators often look at one place first: the people closest to the victim, relationships, partners, anyone with emotional proximity. Which brings us back to someone we've already mentioned, someone who, at this point, still appeared to be outside the frame of suspicion: Stephen McCullagh. While all of this was unfolding, while investigators were gathering evidence, while Natalie's family was trying to process the unthinkable, there was one detail that continued to stand strong. Stephen McCullagh had been live streaming for hours on the very night Natalie was killed. The footage existed. The timestamps were there. Viewers had watched it happen in real time. And that kind of evidence is powerful. It doesn't just suggest innocence, it feels like proof. And yet, in investigations like this, there's always a moment where something doesn't sit right. Not because of one big contradiction, but because of small ones. Tiny inconsistencies, details that don't fully align. At this stage, those inconsistencies hadn't fully surfaced yet. But they were there, waiting, because the truth hadn't revealed itself. Not yet. There's a point in every investigation where something stops feeling right. Not wrong enough to prove anything, not obvious enough to accuse someone, but just enough to make investigators look twice. And in this case, that moment didn't come from a witness. It came from a screen. At the center of this case was something that felt almost untouchable. A live stream? Stephen McCullagh, sitting in his home, playing video games, interacting with viewers, existing in real time, for hours, on the same night Natalie was killed. It wasn't just an alibi. It was a performance of normality. And that's what made it so effective, because we trust what we can see. We trust movement, voice, presence. We trust timestamps. We trust consistency. And for a while, everything about that live stream appeared consistent. But investigations don't rely on what feels right. They rely on what holds up under pressure. So detectives began doing what they always do. They slowed everything down, frame by frame, minute by minute, detail by detail. And when you slow something down enough, you stop seeing what it looks like and start seeing what it actually is. At first, the inconsistencies were subtle, so subtle that an average viewer would never notice them. But investigators aren't average viewers. They noticed patterns, repetition, timing that felt slightly off, moments that didn't flow naturally, small things. But in a case like this, small things matter, because real life isn't perfectly repetitive. Human behavior isn't perfectly looped. Then came the question that shifted the entire direction of the investigation. What if this wasn't live? What if what people believed was happening in real time was actually pre-recorded? That single possibility changes everything. Because if the live stream wasn't live, then the alibi disappears. And if the alibi disappears, so does the distance between suspect and crime. Now, this kind of claim can't be based on suspicion alone. It has to be proven. So investigators began testing the footage against reality. They compared timestamps, checked digital logs, analyzed behavior patterns, and slowly, something began to emerge. The stream wasn't interactive in the way it should have been. Responses didn't always align with live chat. Movements repeated in ways that didn't make sense. It started to look less like a live broadcast and more like something that had been carefully constructed. And then it clicked. The live stream wasn't happening in real time. It had been pre-recorded, prepared, set up in advance, played back to create the illusion of presence. Which means that while people believed Stephen McCullagh was at home, visible, accounted for, he wasn't. He was somewhere else. Because now the timeline shifts completely. The window between 8:52 p.m. and 9:30 p.m., the exact period when the suspect was seen entering and leaving Natalie's home, is no longer a mystery. It becomes an opportunity, an opening, one that had been carefully created by building an alibi that could run without him. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't something that happened in a moment of uncontrolled emotion. This required planning. Think about it. Recording hours of footage, setting it up to appear live, ensuring it would run without interruption, creating something believable enough to withstand initial scrutiny. That's not panic. That's preparation. And when a crime involves that level of preparation, it tells us something deeply unsettling about the person behind it. Because this isn't just about what he did, it's about how he thought. To create an alibi like this, you have to believe something, that people will trust what they see, that no one will question it deeply enough, that technology can be used not just to connect, but to deceive, and perhaps most chilling of all, that you can stand in front of the world appearing normal while hiding something devastating just beneath the surface. Once the live stream was no longer trusted, investigators began re-examining everything connected to Stephen McCullagh, his movements, his communications, his behavior before and after the crime. And patterns started to emerge, not just physical ones, but psychological ones. Shifts in tone, inconsistencies in statements, subtle signs that something wasn't aligning with the version of reality he was presenting. At this stage, the case begins to transform. What started as uncertainty becomes direction. What felt like confusion becomes focus. Because now, investigators aren't just asking what happened, They're asking, did he plan this from the beginning? And if so, why? And this is where we return to something we mentioned earlier. Natalie was pregnant. 15 weeks. That detail isn't separate from the crime. It's central to it. Because in many cases like this, motive isn't random. It's rooted in fear, in pressure, in consequences someone isn't willing to face, responsibility, exposure, a future that doesn't align with the one someone wants. And sometimes, instead of confronting that reality, they try to erase it. At this point, the perfect alibi is no longer protecting him. It's doing the opposite. It's becoming the strongest evidence against him. Because it doesn't just place him near the crime. It shows intent, planning, deception, control. It turns a suspect into something far more certain. There's something different about a courtroom. It's not just a place where facts are presented, it's where illusions fall apart. Because in here, you don't just tell a story, you prove it. And for Stephen McCullagh, everything he carefully constructed, every detail he thought would protect him, was about to be taken apart, piece by piece. By the time the case reached court, the narrative had completely shifted. This was no longer a mystery about who killed Natalie McNally. It was about how he tried to get away with it. And more importantly, why? The prosecution didn't need to rely on speculation. They had something stronger, a timeline, digital evidence, CCTV footage, behavioral inconsistencies, and at the center of it all, the live stream. What once looked like protection now became the most damning evidence in the entire case. Experts broke it down, frame by frame. They showed how the stream wasn't live, how it had been recorded in advance, how it lacked genuine interaction, how moments repeated in ways real life never would. And suddenly, something terrifying became undeniable. While the world believed he was sitting safely at home, he was somewhere else entirely. Once the alibi was removed, everything aligned with chilling clarity. The CCTV footage, the time window, the movement in and out of Natalie's home. There was no longer distance between him and the crime. There was only proximity, opportunity, and intent. The court didn't just see what happened. They saw how it was prepared, because this wasn't a spontaneous act. This was a decision. Recording hours of footage in advance, setting up a false reality, creating a digital version of himself to stand in his place. That requires thought, control, calculation. And when you step back and look at it fully, it reveals something deeper than guilt. It reveals mindset. At the heart of the case was something deeply human and deeply disturbing. Natalie was pregnant, 15 weeks. That meant responsibility, a future, a connection that couldn't simply disappear. And for him, that future may have felt like a threat to his life, his image, his control. Because in many cases like this, the motive isn't chaos, it's avoidance. Avoiding consequences, avoiding exposure, avoiding a reality someone refuses to accept. And instead of facing it, he chose to eliminate it. But beyond the legal arguments, beyond the evidence and strategy, there was something else in that courtroom. Grief. Natalie wasn't just a case. She was a person who should still be here. A woman who had plans. A daughter whose family trusted she was safe. A mother-to-be who never got to meet her child. 2 lives gone. And no explanation can ever balance that loss. When the verdict came, it didn't feel like a twist. It felt inevitable. Because by that point, the truth had already revealed itself. Stephen McCullagh was found guilty of murder, not just for the act itself, but for the planning, the deception, and the calculated attempt to escape responsibility. Justice, in the legal sense, had been served. But justice doesn't rewind time. It doesn't undo what was done. And this is where we step back. Because cases like this force us to confront something uncomfortable. Danger doesn't always look dangerous. It doesn't always come from strangers. Sometimes it comes from someone who feels familiar, someone who smiles, someone who reassures, someone who builds trust while quietly preparing to break it. And that's what makes this story so important, not just because of what happened, but because of what it teaches us to notice. Stephen McCullagh didn't just commit a crime. He created a version of reality that people believed. A man live streaming, talking casually, appearing completely normal, while in truth, something else was unfolding entirely. And that duality, that split between appearance and reality, is what makes this case so chilling, because it reminds us not everything we see is real. It's easy in stories like this to focus on the crime, the method, the deception, the investigation, but we don't want to end there, because this story isn't about him. It never was. It's about Natalie McNally, her life, her future, everything that was taken. And remembering that is what gives this story meaning beyond the details. If there's one thing we take away from this case, it's this. Sometimes the most dangerous situations don't feel dangerous at all. They feel normal, familiar, safe, until they're not. And awareness, real awareness, comes from understanding stories like this. Not just watching them, but learning from them. Before you go, if this story made you think or feel something, please like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, kindly do so. It helps you not miss the next story, and more importantly, it helps you start to recognize dangerous patterns in real life. The more you understand them, the better you can protect yourself and your loved ones. Because sometimes, danger doesn't look dangerous, and the more we learn to see it, the safer we become.